Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Every once in a while I get a new handheld that reminds me why I started this channel in the first place. And I think one of the best reminders I've had recently is the TrimUI Brick. And usually the word brick is a bad word when it comes to emulation handhelds, but with this one it's actually very fitting. The TrimUI Brick is solid and sturdy feeling and also has nice flat buttons which make it very pocketable, so it is somewhat brick shaped. But the thing that makes it stand out is the display. It's only 3.2 inches, but it has a resolution of 1024 by 768. And that amount of pixel density and crispiness is really stunning on this little handheld. And so in this video, I want to go over all the reasons why I've fallen in love with the TrimUI Brick over the past couple weeks of testing, and why it's now become my go-to small handheld. In fact, this has even replaced the MinUI Mini for me, and that I never thought was going to be possible. Anyway, we got a lot to talk about here, so grab a snack and drink, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's start by talking about what is the TrimUI Brick. And it's essentially the vertical version of the TrimUI Smart Pro that came out last year. So this one is a little bit bigger and also horizontal with a larger screen. But they do have the exact same chip, which is the all-winner A133 Plus, as well as 1 GB of RAM. And so in terms of performance, it's going to be the same song and dance that we've seen around this $60 price point, which means that it'll play up through PS1 no problem, and then other systems like Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast will struggle, but many games will be playable. But one of the main benefits of reusing the same chip is that many of the custom firmware solutions that we had for the TrimUI Smart Pro have already been ported over to the TrimUI Brick. And we'll go over a few of those options here in this video. Now, I've already mentioned the 3.2-inch display with the resolution of 1024 by 768, but we also have Wi-Fi as well as Bluetooth. And of note, it has a 3000 mAh battery, which I found to give me somewhere between like 4 and 5 hours of battery life. Now, my review unit came from KeepRetro. These guys are a third-party retailer, and they're selling it for $68 with free shipping. Of note, that $68 price point does not come with a games card, so if you want to have preloaded games, you'll have to pay an additional $5. And they also sell additional accessories, including a carrying case and a screen protector. And one thing of note, I'm not a huge fan of the glass on the screen. It's quite smudgy and fingerprinty, and so I found that even when using a microfiber cloth, it's actually pretty hard to get these smudges off. And so I think that a screen protector will actually be a good deal with this device. And so in general, when it comes to the pricing of this, I found it somewhere between $60 and $70 depending on where you pick it up, and AliExpress is usually going to be the cheapest if you can find it on sale. But I will leave a link to KeepRetro in the video description below as a thank you for sending over this review unit. And like with all my reviews, all opinions are my own. They're not going to see this ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. So let's go ahead and jump into the unboxing. So we obviously have the device itself, and then a bunch of other stuff underneath. To start, we have a pretty comprehensive instruction manual that will walk you through most of the operations of this device. And we also have a short USB-A to USB-C charging cable. And this is a unique thing for me. They actually have additional shoulder buttons on the back. These are interchangeable. We will test these out in a moment. Now let's take a look at the device itself, and obviously I got the black model. Right now they're also selling a white model, but they are planning on releasing a purple and red model as well. And to give you an idea of how much I like this device, as soon as I picked it up, within a few minutes I actually went and ordered the white one because I personally like white devices better, and that's how much I liked it just in the first impression. And knowing me, I will probably pick up that red one because that looks awesome as well. Now, first impression with the TrimUI Brick is that it feels super solid and high quality. For example, it doesn't have a hollow feeling to it. Instead, it's just really sturdy. It took me a while to notice, but this back plate is also made out of metal. Everything else is made out of plastic, but yeah, this one's a little bit different. Now, the plastic itself does have a nice texture to it. It's a little bit smudgy because of the black model here, but not too bad. And I also like the somewhat shallow and distinct ribbing right here. It reminds me of the Analog Pocket. Now, my next impression about the device, besides just the quality itself, were these two function buttons right here on the front. We've got quite a few ways to customize this device, including the functions button, a menu button, but then also a toggle switch as well. And each of these can be programmed by the operating system for different functions, and I think that's pretty cool. I also really like the overall size of this device. It's about the same size as a MinUI Mini, but not quite as wide. It's a little bit more narrow. In fact, before we even start testing buttons and stuff, let's do some size comparisons right now. Let's start with vertical handhelds that are smaller than the TrimUI Brick. We'll start with the GKD Pixel. This one is quite quite a bit smaller. I think this screen here is about 2 inches. So yes, this one's a micro device, whereas the TrimUI Brick I would consider to be a mini device. Speaking of which, here is the Mio Mini version 4. This one has a 2.8-inch screen. And I've always loved how small and compact the Mio Mini is, but the screen has always felt a little bit on the small side. And I think that the TrimUI Brick does a pretty good job of bridging that by making it not that much larger, but then also having a larger and sharper screen. Here's the side-by-side with the Mio Mini Plus. This one screen is a little bit bigger, it's 3.5 inches, but you can see that the size between the two devices are relatively similar. Another device that's slightly larger than the Mio Mini is the Anbernic RG35XX Plus. Now this one I didn't have loaded up with the Genesis version of Aladdin, so we'll have to stoop down to the Super Nintendo one instead. Either way, you can see that the TrimUI Brick is smaller than this one, both in terms of height as well as width. Now another device that's pretty interesting for a comparison is one that I have not reviewed yet. This is the Powkiddy RGB20 Pro. This one is quite a bit larger, but the interesting thing here is that I think they have the exact same screen, same dimensions as well as resolution. And we'll save that Powkiddy for a future review video. Instead, let's move over to the Analog Pocket. Now in terms of design and layout, these are actually pretty similar handhelds. They both have super high resolution displays and obviously the Game Boy form factor, but a little bit more elevated and modern. And you can see that when showing 4:3 content, they actually have about the same size screen in terms of dimensions. Now moving on to screens that are quite a bit larger, here is the Anbernic RG40XXV. This one has a 4-inch display, but the TrimUI Brick is just a little bit more powerful than this one. Now another vertical handheld with a lot more power is the Anbernic RG406V. The 4-inch display on this one is quite a bit larger, and the device itself is also massive. Now if you're not familiar with all these retro handhelds, let's go back in time and look at some OGs. So here we are with the original Game Boy DMG and then also a Game Boy Color with an IPS laminated screen. And so this one is quite a bit smaller than the Game Boy Color, although the screen is about the same size. So when it comes down to it, I feel like the TrimUI Brick is kind of in a middle ground between the Mio Mini and the Mio Mini Plus. If you've ever felt that the original Mio Mini was just a little bit too small to fully enjoy, then I think this might be a good upgrade. At the same time, if you've ever felt like the Mio Mini Plus is maybe just a little bit too wide to be fully pocketable, then the TrimUI Brick might be a better solution. And I think in terms of just overall design and feel, these are very different. I've always felt like the Mio Mini Plus is kind of like a modern plastic Game Boy, but the TrimUI Brick feels more like an elegant and expensive device, which is kind of crazy considering they are both around the same price point. So long story short, I really do like the size of the TrimUI Brick. I think it is a really small, pocketable, everyday carry sort of handheld. I don't think I would use this as my primary handheld, but it's definitely something that I can throw in my pocket. In fact, over the past couple weeks of testing this device, there have been quite a few times where I've just thrown this in my pocket to just have around with me. For example, last weekend we went and saw Wicked, which I thought was really great, but I was tricked because I did not know it was a part 1 of 2. I thought it was going to be the whole thing. Either way, I took this with me when we went, and so I had a few minutes to kill, before the preview started and whatnot, and so I was able to play this for a few minutes, and it was a great experience. And so for me, this is a great size. It's super pocketable, and the 3.2-inch screen still makes it very enjoyable as well. I kind of feel like it is an in-between device, something that you'll carry around with you to be able to play in a pinch, but once you get home, you'll be able to play a device that's maybe a little bit bigger and more comfortable. Okay, so now let's actually start talking about the controls and I/O. So let's start with the D-pad. This is soft and clicky. You can see that it barely pushes down when you press down on it, but it's still nice and tactile. And this is kind of a hallmark of TrimUI devices. It's got a nice soft clickiness to it, which makes it very shallow, but then also not loud. And this works out well with games like Contra, where you have to have very precise inputs. And I'm not getting any accidental diagonals. Essentially, I will get some clicky feedback anytime I push it in one direction or the other. And so even though it's not a classic feel in terms of like a rubber membrane, mushy kind of feedback, it's still really nice and precise, and so I like it. It also works out pretty well when it comes to fighting games because you have that precise feedback. And so it's one of those things where you know exactly when you pull off the move because you get that forced feedback. Now personally, I think this D-pad's a little bit small and hard to play with a lot of fighting games. I think it would hurt your thumb over time. But if you wanted to sneak in a quick round or two while waiting in line at Costco, then I think this might be a pretty good solution. Okay, now let's talk about these face buttons. They are soft and clicky, also very shallow, but relatively quiet as well. Let me give you a quick audio test so you can hear what they sound like. And here they are compared to the relatively quiet rubber membrane sounds of the Mio Mini Plus. And so overall, I think they are relatively quiet and easy to press down on, and I like the fact that they're mostly shallow, which makes this very pocketable. Now also on the front we have these two function buttons, which are LED backlit and programmable. And then also down beneath we've got our menu button, select and start. And then also we've got two stereo speakers, which is very rare with a small vertical handheld. Let's do a quick audio test. And this is with Streets of Rage 2 at full volume. Okay, so overall I would say that the audio quality here is not the best. Number one, I don't think the speakers get very loud. Compared to other devices in this price point, it seems like it's about 25% quieter. Now in general, I wouldn't really play these at full blast anyway, but it is something to consider. In terms of audio quality, it also is lacking bass, which is expected with a smaller device like this, but at least this sound is relatively crisp and clear. I'm also not a huge fan of the placement of these speakers because your thumbs will just naturally cover over the speaker holes, and so that will negatively affect the quality of the audio as well. Now because this is a smaller device and something you would probably use on the go, I also wanted to test out headphone quality. And here I found the experience to be a lot better than just using these speakers on the device. The audio sounded rich and clear and got quite loud. And of note, the stock operating system comes with a media player, so if you wanted to play things like MP3s or movie files, you could do that on this device as well. Now let's take a look at the back as well as the shoulder buttons. So these are pretty interesting because these are removable. In fact, to remove them, it is quite easy. You just slide them right out. One thing worth noting is that I've heard from people who have lost their buttons because they got lost in their pocket or in their car. So it is quite easy to remove these buttons, which can be a good or a bad thing. Now the buttons themselves are easy to press down on. They're a little bit clicky, but not too loud as well. And of note, this back part right here actually lights up as well, and you can also program this. And I like the feel of these default buttons altogether. You know, the R2 and L2 buttons are a little bit elevated, so it's easy to tell between the two. But let's try out the other ones that came in the box and see if you might like those ones better. So here is the first extra set. These ones are a little bit more rounded against the edge, so it makes it a little bit more slim and pocketable. And then also the L2 and R2 buttons are also elevated more than the L1 and R1. So these I feel are a little bit more compact, but also still very easy to differentiate between each button. And so these are also pretty good, and I think because they don't have a lip like the other one, these might also actually not fall off accidentally. In fact, they are a little bit harder to take off than the previous ones, which might be a good thing. And then finally, here's the third set. So these ones have much more of a ski slope here, so very easy to tell the difference between the two. And it also has a more textured finish here on the side. But I will say that personally, this one is my least favorite because it is a little bit awkward to hold it at such a high angle like this. And so I have not really used these buttons in my testing. So in the end, I've mostly been using these default buttons just because they feel pretty good, and I like the little shelf that they have here on the top as well. But I also think it's pretty genius that we have 3 different options already available, and the fact that they are removable, which means that people, you know, like on Etsy or 3D printers, they're going to be able to come up with other solutions as well. So I almost feel like there's going to be a whole cottage industry around these back buttons on the TrimUI Brick. Now also on the back here, we've got that ribbed texture that I mentioned before. It feels really good when gripping it. And then also tucked away here in the center, we actually have a USB-C OTG port. So this could be used for peripherals, for example, an external controller, but then also I've been using this for a flash drive to be able to transfer files over. And then finally, we've got one more LED light, which is this one right here. So this one will also turn on when you have the device on. And the colors and programming and everything else is going to depend on the operating system that you're using. Now taking a look at the sides, we have our volume up and down here on the left. And then on the right side, we have our power and sleep button, and then also a toggle, which we'll talk about later. And then finally on the bottom, we've got a micro SD card slot, a reset button, our USB-C port for charging, a microphone input, and then our headphone jack. And so that's really about it when it comes to the hardware. I think it's a solidly built device with all sorts of nice little tweaks to it. Now before we talk about ergonomics, let's do a quick teardown. And the first thing worth noting is the CPU placement and how that plays into that metal panel on the back. You can see we have the CPU up top and then a thermal pad that goes directly into that metal backing. And so essentially this handheld uses that back metal plate as a big ol' heatsink. And unfortunately, this is a pretty hot running CPU, and so you will feel the heat on the back. And so I found that playing basically any game for about 10 minutes or longer, you will start to feel that heat right here. And unfortunately, the way I often hold devices like this is that I rest my index fingers up top on these back shoulder buttons. And that gives me more leverage to be able to hold it comfortably. And unfortunately, I found that this makes these fingers really hot on the sides right here. Now, thankfully for most games, I can just hold it back here. And so I will often play it like this and just not rest my fingers up above. And that's made it a lot easier to use. And so in general, if I'm not going to be using these shoulder buttons other than, for hotkeys, this is how I've been holding the device. And admittedly, that does make the device a little bit more cramped feeling when I'm wrapping my hands around it. I wish that I had more space to be able to go across the full back of the device. And honestly, that's my only main criticism of this device. I feel like it is a bad design because it does warm the back up quite a bit. If you try to play something for over 30 minutes, or if you try to play something more intensive like a Dreamcast or a Nintendo 64 game, it will get even hotter. And so unfortunately, this design choice has changed the way that I hold this device. And so I've just learned to kind of hold it like this. And honestly, it's not half bad. I think that it's big enough to be able to hold comfortably, but I definitely wouldn't want to play it for hours on end like this.
Hey, this is Next Day / Editing Russ. So I just bought this new fancy thermal camera to be able to show you a little bit better and more concretely exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to ambient heat. And the readouts are in Celsius here, but you can see it's about 34, 35 degrees here just with my hand. And for reference, internal body temperature is about 37 degrees. So this all makes sense. I'm running the AC right now, so my skin is a little bit cooler. And if we look at the device while turned off, you can see that it is nice and cool to the touch, about 29 degrees Celsius. Now for my quick test here, I did 5 minutes of playing Super Nintendo. I'm playing Tecmo Super Bowl III and of course as the Seattle Seahawks. And after about 5 minutes, it does start to warm up. In fact, if we look at the back of the device right now, it is getting between 33 and 34 degrees Celsius. So it's about the same temperature as my skin right now, and so it's just slightly warm but not unpleasant. Now let's play another 5 minutes of Tecmo Super Bowl III here on the Super Nintendo, and it is getting quite a bit warmer. And so now the temperatures are about 36 degrees Celsius, and so this is quite warm. I wouldn't put it at the point of being unpleasant. In fact, if you're playing in colder temperatures, this might be pretty nice. And of note, it does get hotter on the bottom part of the screen, but my hands never really touch this spot, so it doesn't really bother me. But you can see here it is getting up to about 41, 42 degrees Celsius on the front. Now, when the TrimUI Brick does get unpleasantly warm is when really pushing it with stuff like Sega Dreamcast and Nintendo 64. So here, after 5 minutes of getting my butt kicked in Dead or Alive 2, it is quite a bit warmer. After just 5 minutes, it's getting about 40 degrees Celsius, so this is where it gets unpleasant for me. And the front at this point is about 43 degrees Celsius. And so now, 5 more minutes of getting my butt kicked with Dead or Alive 2, it is very warm, to the point where I can actually feel it even though my fingers are not pressing against the back. And so now that metal panel on the back is about 43 degrees Celsius. That's about 110 degrees Fahrenheit, so not enough to actually burn you, but that is really unpleasantly warm. And the front panel is around 44 degrees Celsius. Again, I don't really feel the heat from the front, it's more from the back. So this is one of the reasons why I don't play heavy-duty games on this device as much. I basically cap it out at PS1. And as a comparison, I played Mega Man X on Super Nintendo for about 10 minutes to see what the temperatures would be on the back. And the whole experience was quite cool, to the point where I never really felt it getting warm. And if we look at the back after about 10 minutes, yeah, it's about 33, 34 degrees, so this is not to the point where I even notice it. So when playing retro systems all the way up to Super Nintendo and PS1, I think the TrimUI Brick is fine. It's about 36 degrees on the back, which is enough to feel warm but not unpleasantly so. But getting up to like 43 degrees when playing things like Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, for me, that's just not really something I'm willing to do. So long story short, I think the TrimUI Brick is good when it comes to playing retro games. Basically everything up through PS1, no problem there. But even though the chip is powerful enough to be able to play some Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, the overall experience is just not that great. Not only are we hampered by the lack of an analog stick, but yeah, it gets quite warm to the point where I actually don't want to play it.
Anyway, going back to the teardown, you can see that we have our battery here on the bottom as well as our rumble motor. And one really interesting thing is they've used this nice little prong connection to be able to connect to the back for the buttons as well as the LED lights. And overall, I would say the design here is pretty good. You can see that we have our speaker connectors right here. We've got our Wi-Fi antenna up above. And overall, it just looks like a very nice, clean design and easy to access. And so overall, I think the TrimUI Brick is a really nice design in terms of hardware other than this metal backing. I'm not not really sure why they went this route, if they thought it was going to be more premium, but overall it just makes the device a little bit more hot. I almost feel like it would have been better to have passive ventilation right here to allow the heat to escape as opposed to spread across the entire back plate. Okay, now let's talk about our available software options. We'll start with the stock operating system. And this is almost identical to the TrimUI Smart Pro, so we're just going to kind of run through it so you can see what it's going to be like. On the front page, we've got a bunch of customizable collections. So if you want to play things like NES multi-carts, you have that, or things like Bomberman games, they're all listed here. If we tab over using one of these shoulder buttons, we get to the main section, which is going to be the games menu. So here you can navigate through all the various systems and then open up your games from here. And there are a lot of systems represented. I think there's about 35 altogether. And so the idea here is you can go in, pick your system, and then pick your game. And it's going to be organized differently depending on the system. For example, with Super Nintendo, you can see it's all indexed by the first letter of whatever game you want to play. For other systems like Game Boy, they have a numbered list down here, but then also the full collection in alphabetical order. And of note, there are a lot of games, even on the 64GB card that I'm testing with. You can see that there are 1,800 Game Boy games. And so that means there's going to be a lot of duplicates and other region games here. It's going to be a bit of a mess. And so my recommendation is always to add your own game files. That way you know where they come from, and then also you can organize them into something that's a little bit easier to navigate. But if you're just looking for something that's preloaded, yes, there are a bunch of games on here, but it just might be more games than you actually need. Now, if we tab over one more, we can go into the port section, and unfortunately they have a bunch of modern commercial ports on here. It's shady enough that they've got a bunch of ROMs on here, but I really don't like the fact that they have modern games like Balatro and Sonic Mania. Now, thankfully, one of the other operating systems available for this device does have Portmaster, which means that you can legitimately add your own games like this. And so if you want to play these games and build the port yourself, that is also an option. Now, moving over one more tab, we have the apps section. We've got a couple different things we can do, like go directly into RetroArch, and here's that media player we talked about before. We can also go into the function key setting, and this will change out what these two buttons as well as the switch will do. So for example, in the first page, you can see we can change what this left button does. I have it set as a D-pad and joystick toggle. This means that if I'm playing something like Nintendo 64 and I want the D-pad to behave as an analog stick, I just have to press this button in-game. I can also do other things like change out the CPU clock speed as well as the brightness of the screen, or also just turn off the LED lights as well. If we press right on the D-pad, we have the same options, but this time for the second button. And you can see here I have it set for the LCD screen. So if I tab on this, you can see that I can alternate between a bunch of different brightness settings. Finally, if we move over one more tab, we have this function key setting. I have mine set up for the LED lights. So if I turn this off, the LED lights will turn off and I can turn them back on. But you've also got other options like power save and performance mode, and you can also turn on turbo for any button you would like. Now, tabbing over two more times, we get into the settings menu. Here we can do things like adjust the display. And here you can see we have 10 degrees of brightness. This is at 5 out of 10. In addition, we can fine tune the LED lights to make them either brighter or darker depending on which ones we like. You can also make adjustments to the screen itself. If you want to make it more saturated or make it more exposed, you can change that all right here. In addition, in the settings menu, this is where you'll set up things like Wi-Fi as well as Bluetooth. And really, that's about it when it comes to the stock operating system. It's a very simple process. You'll just go in, choose your game, and then start it from here. And so if you are looking for a very simple navigation experience and you don't really know anything about retro handhelds, yes, if you get a preloaded card, this will be fairly well set up. But one of the great things about these TrimUI devices is the community around them, because we also have other software options. And as of making this video, there are two that are running right now. Let's try those out. Now, our first option is called KNULLI. This is a fork of Bada Sera, but made for smaller handhelds like this. And it's already working for the TrimUI Smart Pro, but there is a test alpha build available for this device as well, which is what I'm using here. And the nice thing about KNULLI is that it's very robust. For example, we have these really nice themes, and we also have additional tools like Portmaster. Now, of note, with this alpha test build, it's very early in its release. And so, for example, Wi-Fi is not working on this right now. So unfortunately, I'm not able to go into Portmaster and actually use it just yet, but once it gets into final release, it'll work fine. For that same reason, I'm not able to go in and scrape any of my box art, so right now it's a pretty bare bones experience, but it is pretty nice. I love all the different theme options we have for KNULLI, so we can download and install different themes if Wi-Fi was working. Either way, I like the default one, which is is Artbook Next, I think it looks really good. And the nice thing about KNULLI is that most of these systems are underwritten with RetroArch, and so you can make all sorts of adjustments within these settings to be able to really fine-tune your experience. And so if you are looking for something that's a little bit more beautiful and robust than the original stock operating system, I think that KNULLI is a really great way to go. I also love the fact that we have things like Portmaster, which really expands the amount of games that we can play on this. And then finally, the other operating system that's already working for the TrimUI Brick is this one called MinUI. This is a very bare bones and simple and focused operating system. It's all text-based, so you basically will go through, find your system, and then add your games from here. And loading this up is super simple. I did this the other day, and it already has a working public release. Now, the thing about MinUI is that it is limited in the systems that it supports. So things like arcade games or Nintendo 64, they're not going to work with the stock version of MinUI. There are community-based solutions that will also add those systems, but it's a little bit more of an advanced topic. And honestly, one of the strengths of MinUI is the fact that it is so simple, you could just go in and out of your games. And so personally, when I've been testing this over the past couple weeks, I've been using MinUI just because it's so simple, and the majority of the games that I actually want to play on the TrimUI Brick are all these classic systems that are already available. And one of my favorite things about MinUI is that we have a universal menu system. If I just tap on this button down here, it brings up this menu. And here it's very simple to navigate, but then also it has a little bit more advanced features. So number one, we can go in and save and load a save state. So if we want to save a game, we can just save it right here. Now if we go in, it's already been saved and I can load it back up. Not only that, if I quit out of the game from here, once I go back into the same game, you can see there's now a resume option. So if I press the X button instead of A, it's actually going to resume the game that I had last saved. And so here we are back in that save state that I had just made. Now, in addition, we've got an options menu here, and there have been some significant updates recently to MinUI. Let's start with the front end section. So here we've got the screen scaling options, which I think are really important. And down below, you can see all of the options for each of these settings, but here you can see that native is integer scaling, then we have aspect ratio, and then full screen to make it full size. Now below that, we have the screen effect. We've got a couple different options. We have none, but then also scan lines, as well as a grid effect. When it comes to Game Boy Color, which is what we're playing right now, I prefer a grid effect. Now below that, we have screen sharpness options. We have crisp, as well as soft, and then sharp. Now sharp is using nearest neighbor sampling, which is going to give a pretty sharp image, but not super crisp. Meanwhile, the soft one is going to be a bilinear filter, which means that everything will look balanced, but it will look softer. But one thing that's recently been added to the TrimUI Brick is this crisp option. This is like using a normal 2x filter with bilinear filtering, which means it's going to blow up the screen and then shrink it back down using bilinear filtering, giving us the best of both worlds. This will balance out the pixels, but then also make them very crisp, and I'll show you examples here in a moment. In addition, you can adjust the CPU clock speed, so you have power save as well as normal and performance. So for something like Game Boy Advance, you can set it to power save, and then that's going to save you on battery life. Now, in addition, if we go into the emulator settings, we have a bunch of different options. These are a lot like the core options available within RetroArch. So here we can do things like adjust the color correction and palettes depending on the system that you're playing. Also within this menu, you can change out the controls. These are all going to be set by default, but if you ever wanted to change them to something else, this is where you could do it. But the other thing that I think is really awesome is the shortcuts menu. And there's a few things that are really important about this. Number one is that we have this new save and quit option. So as you can see, I have mine set to menu plus start. That means that if I press this button and this at the same time when playing a game, it's going to save my game, but then also quit out of it. And so this is a really quick way to get in and out of your games. I press menu and start, it's going to close out of the game, and then when I go back into it, I can press X to resume it. And so it's the same as doing that save state thing, but I don't have to actually go into the menu to do it. And this has been great because it saves me a bunch of time while playing games. Now, the other thing that's really cool about these new shortcuts is that we have cycle scaling as well as cycle effect. And you can see that I have them set for L3 and R3, which are these two front buttons right here. And then finally, I have toggle fast forward with R2, so I can press this and it'll go into fast forward and then back into normal speed. Now, these cycle scaling and cycle effect have been really handy when playing any sort of game. So to give you an example, if I press this L3 button, it's going to cycle between my different sizes. So right now it's doing integer scaling. I press it one more time, it's going to be an aspect scaling, which means it's going to be full screen, at least with the aspect ratio. And then I can press it one more time to blow it up to full screen. And honestly, depending on the system in the game, I will often cycle between between these, and it's really handy to have this button right here. For example, with a Game Boy game, I prefer to use integer scaling, although it does make the screen a little bit smaller, it is super sharp. But for other games, I may want to make it a little bit bigger to make the text easier to read. In addition, I can change out my grid effects by using the right button. So here I can have it with no grid effect, then scanline, and then the grid as well. And so this is another thing that I can toggle while in a game, and I think it's great. So I can really fine-tune the experience right here without having to go into the actual settings. But in general, with Game Boy, I do use integer scaling and the grid effect. I think it looks the best. Another reason I've been using MinUI a lot is because it's so easy to get in and out of your games. For example, here, all I have to do is just press and hold the power button for a couple seconds. It's going to save my game and then power the device off. From there, all I have to do is just press and hold the power button for a couple seconds. It's going to start up MinUI and then also resume my game exactly where I was. And with a small pocketable device like this is one of my favorite features because I can just jump in and out of my games really easily. And that's one of the great things about having a pocketable handheld. And so no matter what, if I'm just running around and trying to just kind of jump in and out of my games, MinUI has been a more seamless experience for me. It does have some limitations, including the fact that not every system will run on this operating system, but I just love the overall experience, and it plays most of the games that I'm going to play anyway. Now let's talk a little bit about the screen when it comes to playing games. Starting with Game Boy and Game Boy Advance, this actually, when running at integer scale, is a 5x integer scale because we have such a high resolution. Now if we blow it up to full screen, but the aspect ratio, this is going to be a 5.3x scale, so a little bit larger. And personally, I think they both look great, both integer scaling being super sharp, but then also the aspect one being just a little bit bigger. And even with the aspect ratio one turned on, it's still a very sharp image, and so I think it looks really good. And so it'll come down to basically how good your eyesight is. If you don't mind having a smaller screen, I think the integer scale is the way to go, but if you want it a little bit bigger, you can do that as well. Now for Game Boy Advance, I have it set up the same way. So I have it at integer scaling, or I can go to aspect, or also to full screen. I'm also using a grid effect, but of course I can turn that off or use scan lines as well. Now at integer scale, this is a 4x upscale, which I think looks amazing. But again, for the most part, I usually use aspect ratio. Even though it's not going to give me perfectly balanced pixels, I still think this looks very good. It's one of those things that because we have such a high pixel density that I don't really mind having imbalanced pixels on a smaller screen. And so personally, I think this would be a great system for Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, and original Game Boy. I think they all are very fitting on this machine. Now when it comes to systems like NES, I do prefer to blow this up to full screen. So this is what it looks like right here. If we do integer scaling, you can see it is quite small, and I think this is a little bit too small for me. So I do prefer to blow it up to full screen instead, and this is the way that I've been playing most NES games. You can also use scanline and grid effects, but personally I've just enjoyed the pixels as they are. Every once in a while I'll use scanline, but not too often. And bear in mind, these scanline and grid effects will darken the screen, and in order to increase the brightness, you can press menu and then volume up, and the screen does get quite bright. In fact, let's talk about the screen brightness here really quickly, because we have a good dynamic range. Here it is at full brightness, and you can see that it is kind of blowing out the screen here on my studio camera. In fact, it is bright enough to be able to play outdoors, especially when playing in the shade. As an example, if you were to play this in your car, for example, when like waiting in line, then this would be a really excellent example. Now, when playing it in direct sunlight, it's a little bit worse. I would say it's at least playable, but not a super enjoyable experience. And it's very rare for a handheld at this price point to get this bright anyway. In fact, I think this is well above average. In fact, here's a comparison of the MiU Mini version 4 at max brightness versus the TrimUI Brick at max brightness. And you can see that it is a night and day difference. So in general, I like the fact that this screen gets so bright. It does increase the amount of heat that you'll feel here on the back, but it is nice to be able to play outdoors with something like this. Now in terms of dimness, it doesn't get super dim. For example, here if I turn off the studio lights, you can see that it's still pretty visible. And so this is something that I would probably be able to play in the evening time, no problem. It's not going to be too bright in that regard. But if you're playing in like pitch black, like in bed, I think this might get a little bit too bright. But I would say that all things considered, in terms of brightness, this is a pretty solid screen, especially at this price point. Now, Super Nintendo is a different story. I found that integer scaling is a little bit too small for me, and so I would rather just play it at full screen instead. And when we set the screen sharpness to crisp, I think it looks really good at full screen like this. And because it's using that normal 2x filter with the bilinear filter, we're actually going to be able to get balanced pixels. You can see right here that Mega Man's life bar in Mega Man X is actually really well balanced. And so playing Super Nintendo at full screen like this is actually a really great experience. And so I've really enjoyed this, especially on MinUI, because it's just so seamless and everything is nice and balanced. And you can set this up with the other operating systems, including KNULLI as well as the stock operating system within RetroArch. But it is nice to be able to make these adjustments without having to do anything else because MinUI is just so simple. Now, Sega Genesis is similar to Super Nintendo, but a little bit better because the integer scaling here is not quite as small. This is a 3x integer scale, and you can see that the black borders are relatively minimal. Now, because we have that crisp option, I do prefer to play it in full screen anyway, but it is nice to be able to use integer scaling with a larger screen like this. So long story short, when it comes to playing just about any system, I love playing them on MinUI because of all the screen options that are baked into the OS. And the fact that we have the hotkey buttons right here just makes things even simpler. And this function toggle also works in MinUI. It essentially is a mute button. Now, another system I found to be really great with this little handheld is PlayStation 1. Even though it's a 3.2-inch screen, I found the text to be just big enough, so I'm able to play games like Final Fantasy X or other role-playing games no problem. Now, I'm not using any sort of resolution upscaling right here, so it's just running at the native resolution, but I kind of like these chunkier pixels anyway. Either way, if you are looking for a smaller device to be able to play PS1 games on, I think this is really nice. Now, when it comes to playing your other systems, things like Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, that is entirely possible, just not on MinUI. You'll have to use either the stock operating system or KNULLI. And like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, those options are a little bit more hit and miss. When it comes down to it, if you want to play a certain Dreamcast game or Nintendo 64 game, I would recommend trying it out and seeing how well it plays. When it comes to Dreamcast, this will take advantage of frame skip, and so some of these games will feel pretty smooth. Nintendo 64 will also be pretty good, but it is hampered by these controls considering the fact that we don't have any analog sticks. So in general, I would say that this device shines the most with PS1 and below, but you can play some of these other systems as well. Okay, that's about it when it comes to testing. Let's go ahead and start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the TrimUI Brick. And honestly, there is a lot to like, but I'm going to narrow it down to just 4 elements. The first is this wonderful screen. I love the fact that we have such a high resolution. It gives us a lot of options when it comes to scaling, and overall it's just very crisp. And even though it is a smaller screen, the fact that we have such a high pixel density makes all these games look a lot sharper than other handhelds. And so even if you have a bigger screen that's like 3.5 inches but with only a 480p resolution, these usually will just not look as good as the TrimUI Brick. And I bet that once more people get their hands on a screen like this with this resolution, we're going to see a bunch of different options pop up. So we will probably see things like special shaders and overlays that will really take advantage of the TrimUI Brick. I also really like the compact size. This is a very pocketable handheld. I tested this device for about 2 weeks before making this video, and I took it around with me in all sorts of scenarios, and every time it was a really good fit. So if you are looking for something that you can treat like an everyday carry handheld, something you can just throw in your pocket and have available when you want it, then I think the TrimUI Brick is a really good solution. I'm also a fan of the TrimUI buttons. They're a little bit unconventional, so they don't have that mushy feel like a classic controller, but I like the fact that they are super precise. And because they are relatively shallow, it makes the whole device very pocketable. And then finally, I think that for everything that we're getting here, it is a pretty amazing price. Even if we only treat it like a PS1 and below and maybe a Portmaster handheld, I think for around $60 or $70, this is a really good value. The screen alone makes it feel like this is something that should cost at least $100, so $70 is pretty crazy to me. Now, of course, like with any other handheld, it is not perfect, so there are a couple things that I want to remind you of. Number one is the fact that I just don't understand why they designed it with the metal plate on the back. This effectively makes it a heatsink for the CPU, which unfortunately is a pretty hot running chip. And after about 10 minutes or so, I think that most people will feel the heat on their fingers as they hold it. Now personally, I've adjusted my playstyle to just not really feel the heat at all, but it is kind of a bummer that I had to adjust it in the first place. And I bet that if you have larger hands, this will make it a more cramped experience. And honestly, that's my one main complaint about the TrimUI Brick. The only other thing worth noting is that I don't think this is a handheld for everyone. At the end of the day, it is a small handheld made for portability, and I think it's really excellent in that regard, but I don't think it would be great as a primary handheld. Instead, like I mentioned before, I think this is an in-between device. By that I mean that when you're out and about, it's perfect because it doesn't take up a lot of space, but is still very enjoyable. However, once I get home, the TrimUI Brick just kind of sits on my desk while I go and play something else. But when it comes down to it, I think this is one of the things that makes the TrimUI Brick really shine. In the end, I don't really need a device that can do everything because I found that there are so many different use cases out there that I really would rather have just maybe 2 or 3 handhelds instead. And I think that this one fits perfectly in that smaller category for me. This is the kind of handheld that you can throw in a pocket, in your purse, or in a backpack, and then it'll just be available when you need it. And there are a ton of different handhelds in this category. In fact, just a month or 2 ago, I made a roundup of all my favorites. And in that video, my favorite was the MinUI Mini version 4. And many of the reasons why I liked it so much are the same reasons why I like the TrimUI Brick. However, there are just as many things I like about the TrimUI Brick that are better than the MinUI Mini version 4. So when all is said and done, I think this one is basically it for me when it comes to mini handhelds for a while. And it's ironic because I don't really like vertical handhelds as much as horizontal ones, but man, I really love this screen. Maybe in the future we will see a horizontal handheld with this same screen, and that might change the paradigm for me, but as it stands right now, the TrimUI Brick was a really surprising handheld. I figured that I would like it okay, but I did not expect it to replace the MinUI Mini. At this point, the only thing that I would hope from TrimUI is to make a similar device but in a horizontal form factor instead. Either way, I think they got a huge hit on their hands, and I can't wait to revisit this device in a few months when we get more software options as well. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you going to pick one of these up, or are you going to wait for it to get a little bit cheaper? Because I bet it'll go down to around $50 here in the future. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.